Kia ora tātou, ko Frances Tokuingwa, and I'm the Participation Manager at New Zealand Opera. And I'm delighted to be talking with Rebecca Meltzer and Brad Cohen. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Would you like to both kind of talk about your roles in Mansfield Park?
You got that.
Kia ora. My name's Rebecca Meltzer, and I am directing this production of Mansfield Park with New Zealand Opera. And I've travelled from the UK to join this fantastic company, and I'm delighted to be here. So thank you for having me.
Kia ora, ko Brad Cohen, tōku ingoa. I'm Brad Cohen, General Director of New Zealand Opera. And I'm kind of musical uncle to this production. It doesn't have a conductor, so I kind of drift in and out, and we prepared musically with the cast last week. So I'm kind of, here and there.
As musical uncle for the production, you've had a really long relationship with Mansfield Park and Mansfield Park's creators, Jonathan Dove and Alistair Middleton. And you were there at the premiere in 2011.
I was at the premiere in Boughton House in Northamptonshire in the UK. It was a stately home. And the Earl of Buccleuch, I think, was our host. And we had a lovely show, and he showed us around his gallery. And then he cooked pasta for us at 2 a.m. in the scullery kitchen. So it was a beautiful event, and it began with a very domestic, familiar kind of environment, which has really been characteristic of the work since then. So it was a lovely start.
So there's quite a distance between a kind of manor house in the UK and bringing the work here to Aotearoa. And why this work as kind of your first programmed piece for our NZ Opera season?
I think the new chapter in what we're doing at NZ Opera is about telling stories that connect with our communities. And so I wanted to find and program a piece that told a story well, that could serve as a kind of indicative model of what opera can be now, opera that's being composed now. And as you say, Frances, I've had a really long friendship and association with both Jonathan and Alistair, the composer and the librettist. And I knew about Mansfield Park, the opera, before it was born. So I've kind of been there all the way through. It's a wonderful piece. It's to a different kind of scale than proscenium opera, the big theatre opera. It's for 10 singers and piano, 4 hands. It's designed to trade on intimacy and proximity, which I think is a really magic quality. And proximity between the stage and the audience is something that's really rare in a lot of opera these days, but it's exactly that proximity and connection that is so important to our journey as a company, going where we're going. So for me, it's a touchstone at the start of my first season of programming to show something new. It's the New Zealand premiere of this work. The composer and librettist are going to be with us in person, so it's a really special event.
I love the idea of the kind of proximity, the intimacy of Mansfield Park. And as a director, Rebecca, that kind of poses lots of challenges for you. The thing that strikes me about Austen's work, and Jonathan Dove's spoken of this too, is the idea that her writing is, when we think of it, it's so naturalistic. It's about our kind of inner emotions. And it seems, in a way, to have lots of oppositions to opera itself as an art form, which is, by its very essence, non-naturalistic. We sing instead of talking. So what are those kind of, how do you come towards those interesting oppositions for this particular work?
So I think I see the intimacy of this particular opera and the fact that it is 10 singers who act as a sort of ensemble cast as a real gift as a director. I love to work in a very detailed way with the cast. And often when you're working in a bigger scale and a sort of cross-arch theatre space, the audience can lose that connection with the real detail, whether that be the physicality, the facial expression, especially those right at the back of the auditorium. So to be able to create a show where you know that the audience are going to be, a couple of meters away from the cast, you can work in a very different way and actually really encourage the performers to discover new ways of connecting with character that really demands a lot of them, actually. And already we're kind of finding the clarity, I think, of storytelling with this piece and this new cast here in New Zealand. But when it comes to kind of the dichotomy between the operatic art form and then I guess, the nuance of the writing in the book, and the fact that, you know, you're dealing with the way Austen conveys sort of the really, think about what I'm trying to say here. So yeah, when you are faced with the contrast between the way Austen writes her characters in her book and the detail of the text, and then the fact that a lot of that has been reduced down to quite a slimline libretto that really kind of takes the essence out of the book. And of course, it's also sung. I think I'm really struck by how Dove and Middleton, so our composer and librettist, managed to retain the essence of the characters and the integrity of the characters, and condense them into 2 hours. And I think they've done so superbly, and it really works well as a sort of partnership between the two of them.
And in a way, I think it's that idea that Alistair, by kind of stripping away some of that kind of those inner monologues that we're so used to with Austen, that's created space for Dove and the music itself kind of bloom in that space. And one thing, Brad, and you know, you've known Jonathan for such a long time, and it would be great, I think, to talk about his music, because I think often people get really concerned if we talk about contemporary opera, and that they're not sure what to expect necessarily. And I was quite interested when Jonathan talked about the idea that he writes with, for this project, his approach was to write with his own 21st century aesthetic, but to suggest an early 19th century world. And maybe you could talk to how he's achieved that.
Yeah, I mean, we can get super technical, and that would be my pleasure. It's a really complex situation about what the Germans would call the reception history of Jonathan's work. He received a lot of criticism earlier in his career, get this, if you can believe this, for being too accessible. Music critics in the London press criticised him for being too accessible. And then we ask ourselves why opera has a problem with audience retention. It's insane. Fortunately, Jonathan's moment has now well and truly come, and people welcome the fact that someone who writes elegantly and compassionately for the singing voice while telling stories actually has a place in the operatic firmament. So it's very interesting. As you say, I've known Jonathan for over 30 years now, and we've done at least 8 projects together, I think, in that time. But we're also close friends, so I'm associated with a lot of his work. And to see his musical voice really come to fruition in a changing external context of cultural understanding about musical language and musical diversity is a really beautiful thing to see. It's like a slow flowering that the environment enables. Jonathan hasn't really changed. He's stuck to his course, and I think that's taken a particular kind of courage. But now the world is more accommodating, and there's more diversity, and that's the direction that, of course, we want to go in. So that's a beautiful trajectory. I want to speak briefly about Alistair and his work as well, because I've worked on many new operas, and one of the principal problems with text for opera is that not many people understand what is required of good writing for opera by a text writer. You have to leave space for the music. So many poets who write libretti really struggle with that, because they have a poetic sensibility which is about compression and filling a space. I think Alistair's particular genius is the ability to condense meaning into very simple, very elegant wording that always leaves space. So for an example, the first scene, we understand exactly who these 10 people are, and there are hardly any words to do it. It's a kind of magic. It's really brilliant. There is not a single word out of place.
Even the way the opera begins, just Mansfield Park, chapter 1.
And there's a kind of knowing, gentle irony in the way that the characters pop out of character to declaim this as the kind of pillars of the work. And that in itself does some heavy lifting. We know, okay, this is a knowing, this is a kind of referential piece. We understand that we can step outside the frame and then begin to tell the story. So it immediately, literally sets the scene. This is the sensibility that we're working within. And the same is true of the music as well. There are lots of what I call loving tributes in Jonathan's writing. And there's a beautiful quote by Mozart when he writes to his father about a Parisian concert that he gives in 1776, I think. He says, "The concerto that I wrote pleased the public, but also will give the cognoscenti real satisfaction." So what he means is that his work is operating on two levels at once. There's the popular sound, which the audience loves, all the fireworks of a Parisian symphony, but there's also real musical knowledge, understanding, and references. Well, Jonathan is a wonderful modern exemplar of that. So, for instance, the scene when Sir Thomas Bertram goes away to Antigua is a farewell scene. He's leaving on a ship to go abroad, and his family, his loved ones, are acknowledging him, paying him tribute, and saying that they're going to miss him. Well, for those of us who love and know Mozart, the Soave sia il vento from Così fan tutte is exactly such a scene. Someone is leaving on a ship to go abroad, and the people who are left behind express their longing. Jonathan pays very subtle tribute to the music of Soave sia il vento and reconfigures it for a 21st century sensibility. It's still very accessible, it's harmonious, for those of us who recognize it, it's a particular pleasure. For those of us who don't recognize it, it's still completely fitting. And that multi-layered elegance and authenticity and honesty is one of the things that I treasure most about not only Jonathan's work, but Alistair's work.
One of the aspects, kind of talking about that authenticity and that kind of elegant economy, which I enjoy, is the idea that within Mansfield Park, there's the idea, of course, of kind of performance within performance. But I grew up watching, the BBC Pride and Prejudice, and loved all the moments where they would gather together and sing to each other, poorly or not so much. And that's kind of what we're doing in this production as well. And there's some intention behind that. But the idea that we're in a single room, that Jonathan has scored it for piano with four hands, and that's not a reduction, or we don't miss an orchestra. It's the perfect kind of instrumentation. But Rebecca, you've also talked about the idea of leaning into that economy of resource, where if there's a tree, then you'll have to find a tree from within the room that you're performing in. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of the fun challenges that provoke?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I was quite inspired by this notion of home theatricals and the reputation that it had within the social kind of circles of the time. So it was looked down on as a pastime that wasn't approved by most people. And I think within this particular story, it's a bit of a linchpin and a turning point for a lot of our characters. Suddenly they're thrown into this theatrical space where boundaries are dissolved somewhat, and they all get up to no good. And I think we've sort of embraced that in a wider scale for the whole production, this idea that, everything that we bring into the storytelling aspect of the show is drawn from that domestic environment. They're making use of what they have to hand to tell the story. We do have a scene that takes place in the book in the wilderness at Southerton Gardens. But of course, for our particular production, everything exists within the one particular room. So how do we create Southerton? Well, we use, maybe there's a scene that happens that doesn't include some cast members. So they can provide the trees in the background. Similarly, there's a gate that appears. Yeah, very elegant shrubbery. And that sort of, theatrical strategy runs throughout this particular staging, and frames the whole piece. And I think, Jonathan clearly embraces that in his musical writing, and the fact that the piece is framed through the breakdown of chapters, and it invites you to break the fourth wall with the audience as well, which again I think is another theatrical strategy that we lean into throughout the piece. And also I think increases the intimacy that you can have with the audience. As soon as you make eye contact, as soon as you acknowledge they're there, they are part of the scenario.
Do you have a particular takeaway that you'd like the audience to have? So, we've brought them in, have this kind of delicious experience where, we'll have singers so close to our audience members, which I personally find really thrilling. But is there something that you hope the audience will take away with them at the end of the experience?
I mean, there are perhaps a couple of things. One is just to have a wonderful evening and to really enjoy and to kind of luxuriate in the fabulous music, the wonderful singing, and what I see as a really beautiful, honest story about a woman who really kind of comes into her own and through the course of the narrative is respected for her principles and what she sees as the right choices and the right path in life. But I think, whilst it dwells on some quite serious and significant life questions, it is just joyful and full of energy, frivolity, fun. But I think a takeaway is perhaps also a really reflective one on how these characters, how we align them to perhaps our own choices in life and our own set of moral principles. Fanny leaves us with this wonderfully kind of eloquent line: we have all within ourselves a better guide if we would attend to it than any other person can be. And for me, it throws everything into a very different light when we consider what that means for us. That's my takeaway.
I think my takeaway would be that audience members feel as passionately connected and as intensely pleasured by the piece as I do myself. I have a really, really intimate connection with this piece. I've seen it many times, and each time I am less able to get to the end without breaking down. I find the end incredibly emotional. And part of the magic of that for me is the power. It's like a dark star. There are only 10 people and 2 pianists on stage, and somehow we go to an enormous dimension emotionally throughout the piece. I feel like all of my programming at New Zealand Opera will be, I'm bringing the pieces that I think are important, communicative, powerful, and connecting to our whānau, to our opera community here. And this is a really wonderful start. So I guess my hope is that people have as good a time as I always do when I sit and watch this piece.